Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Journix webinar. So today we're here to learn about Project Management Office, what works and what doesn't. Virtual is best, PMO business models. Okay, so my name is Krista, and I'm the marketing specialist here at Journix, and I will be your host this morning. I understand that you're all very busy people, but don't worry. In just an hour, we'll have you back to work with hopefully some very useful information that you could take back with you to your business. So before we begin, I wanted to point out that you can expand the screen for better viewing. Just use the percentage icon that's located on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Also, I would like to invite everyone to submit their questions online at any time during the presentation. Just use the questions tab, and they'll be located also on your go-to module. I'll just collect the questions as the presentation moves forward and then read them at the end during our Q&A portion. So that's all for me, and Daryl, I'll let you take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Krista. So today we are here to talk about the PMO, what works and what doesn't. One of the distressing aspects of our consulting practice is every year we get calls to help people reform, restart, reinvigorate their PMOs. And some small surveys we've done from our clients and some other friendly organizations is that basically no one is happy with their PMO. So we've been able to find some commonalities of what is working and what isn't working. And there's basically two problems that we'll bring up today, and then we'll talk about what can we do about that. What is the right business model for the PMO? Not exactly what services the PMO needs to provide, but what is the right business model, right? So many business or functional units are irritated with their PMOs, and so many PMOs are irritated with their business units, their functional units, because their goals are not aligned, right? So this has some very specific takeaways on what you can do if you're influential around your PMO's business model, or what you can do anyway to help build that shared set of goals, right? Sustainability. This is what we hear from PMO directors, VPs of PMOs, the senior people, C-levels who manage PMOs, who fund them and constantly have to deal with PMOs. They have to be sustainable, right? And there are some characteristics of PMOs that fail. And if you see some characteristics here of yours, that doesn't mean that your PMO is failing. These are just characteristics that we found of PMOs. The more of these you have, the better chance your PMO has to fail, right? So here's the biggest one, is the people in the PMO, well-meaning, tasked with process improvement, as well as probably managing projects, supporting various templates and platforms and tools, right? They start getting ideas themselves. And then they try to implement those ideas without building consensus. So that's the first thing we find, is that well-meaning PMO analysts, PMO project managers, PMO leaders start to look around for things to do after the initial problem that caused the formation of the PMO is solved, and then they simply try to do good stuff, right? if your PMO is directive rather than advisory. Last time I looked, on very few org charts was a PMO over business units, right? At best, most PMOs are peer organizations, at best. At worst, they're viewed as overhead, support staff, a necessary evil. So asking a PMO to be directive to the organizations that make money or that do the main set of work, the line organizations, if you will, having a staff organization, which almost all PMOs are, trying to tell them what to do is not a good idea. And many times PMOs overreach, right? They overreach, and as they grow, they start hiring people who do not manage projects. All of those are critical failure factors, and we could turn those around into critical success factors very easily, right? Implement the ideas of others, advise people and add value, set up an agreed upon authority matrix and stay within that, and don't hire anybody who doesn't manage projects. If you have a PMO communications person, you're on the road to ruin. If you have an admin, unless they are directly assisting project managers in their day-to-day managing of projects, maybe as a stand-in or doing some of the project coordination work, you're on the road to ruin, right? If you have tools that are so complicated and you have a relatively small PMO and supporting dozens of people, and you have to have people with an admin role for more than half their job, you're probably on the road to ruin, because all those things will add up to ending up with people who don't manage projects, right? So what really doesn't work? Governance enforcing. Pardon me, it's still allergy season here in Austin, right? So business units of any type report to an executive senior manager. That's where they should get their direction, not from PMOs, right? So the second one, reporting mechanism. Most PMOs set up fairly rigorous reporting mechanisms that take a lot of time. Then they report the low points or the failures in the business unit's projects, and that causes friction between the executive and the business unit, where that friction did not really exist before. So here's one of our large clients, a Fortune 100 distribution and food business. Their PMO has been completely canceled and almost wiped out 3 times because they're constantly reporting on business unit non-performance. They're basically tattling on the people that make the money, that do most of the work, getting them in trouble. So after that happens for a while, a business unit manager with a lot of power turns around and says, this is causing me more grief than it is helping. I'm going to try to fight back on this a little bit. This is just the nature of the process here, right? Now, what can work? PMO should be an advisory unit. The people in the PMO should have expertise that business units need from time to time, especially when business or functional units have to work together, right? They should be friendly. They should be helping the business units reach their goals, not changing their goals, helping them reach their goals, right? And one really good business model, we only have time today to talk in depth about one business model that can work. There are others. We feel the virtual PMO is best. And we'll talk about what that means. So, one of the first attributes of a successful PMO is everybody manages projects. Everybody manages projects. When someone scrolls off a project, they should take a little bit of time to update and own and improve some of the processes that everybody uses. Then they go back on the next big project. Or they take 20% of their time for a couple of weeks and work the process queue, and then they go back full-time to projects. Everybody participates in project improvement from a project manager perspective, and nobody just sits back and thinks up processes that other people have to execute, and they don't. That is the kiss of death. If you have a PMO that's coming up with processes that they're trying to make other people execute, on the road to ruin. So we had the link in red there. I just found out today that one of our articles was accepted in PMI.org Knowledge Center on project estimating. It's a fairly detailed article, so those of you that aren't heavy into estimating, you don't want to take a look at it. And unfortunately, you have to be a PMI member to click onto that and get the information. But I thought I'd share that. So when I do this live with people, I presented it 3 times inside organizations and a couple of times sort of open enrollment live. And here's where I would go around the room and talk to people. But I've done this enough now that I can probably predict the types of folks that are in here. People attend this particular session because they're not happy with the role of their PMO or their role within the PMO or how they need to interact with the PMO. There's some sort of frustration in a sense that it could be a lot better. So with that, if you have any questions this entire session, please just use the chat, communicate with Krista. She'll accumulate those, and we'll address those at the end, because in this format it's just a little tough to do it as we go along. But I promise there'll be time, and we won't monopolize even an entire hour here, right? So we have a team of folks that work in many large organizations, and we feel our real purpose here, sorry about that, is taking a step back and looking at the different business models we see within our clients, right? The basic job of a consultant, other than being an expert or a good pair of hands in some areas, is to cross-pollinate best practices without giving away client IP and generalize those and make them applicable for different types of folks that could apply them, right? That's a consultant's job, to figure out best practices, harvest them, come up with them where necessary, blend them in so they can be applied over a wide audience, right? And so looking at this, let's take a little bit deeper dive into the governance enforcer, right? So here's what I've seen: well-meaning CFOs, CIOs, COOs, senior leadership talking to the poor PMO director or VP and saying, I want you to go out and get every one of those business units to fill this in. I'm sick and tired of not having this information. Go get them to give us the information we need to manage these projects. So the executive, well-meaning but lazy executive, is trying to get the PMO to do something that they have been unable to get the people who directly report to them to do. This is not a winning combination, right? You have a business unit that is tasked with, handling so many Social Security claims or dealing with child support issues or making food and distributing food or performing financial transactions or whatever they do, a military unit going on missions. And here, the biggest danger is the PMO is going to be viewed as a huge distraction from the real business. Right? They kind of act like an auditor, but they're not the audit department. They kind of act like compliance, but they're not the compliance department. These are basically usually optional processes, not mandated, that only apply to certain projects that are not universally performed, right? And there's an incredible amount of friction when a PMO sets up a huge stack of processes that must be done, but when a business unit doesn't do them, there's really no punishment except nagging, right? That puts everybody in a horrible position. The executive that gave the order is not being obeyed. They're not getting full value out of the deal. The PMO is being put in place to tell organizations what to do that they do not directly manage as a peer or service organization. It's a horrible situation. And the business unit is oftentimes put in a bind to try to know where to put their limited amount of time. Do they put it on these PMO processes that really enable the business management, the executive management, to be more disappointed in them? Or do they work on their regular operational work, which brings in the money and or performs the public service? Really, it's a pretty easy choice. And that's why I see so many PMOs that are basically eviscerated over time, because they stand in the way between a business unit trying to get something done and an irritated executive. It's a tertiary communication channel many times, right? So what's the next? That's when PMOs are tasked with going out and getting a lot of information, taking a lot of time, a lot of data entry, huge amount of automation, which, by the way, takes a huge amount of time to deal with, administrative overhead, and then they come up with reports, which makes the business unit projects look bad. That is pretty much the definition of not a sustainable model, wouldn't you say? Right? So somehow this has evolved into the PMO as a reporting mechanism so executives know where to intervene in a business unit project, most of the time making life more difficult for the executive and more difficult for the business unit. Not a good model. So this is an executive problem. The executive has delegated a supposedly mandatory, but usually not really mandatory, set of actions that their functional units are told to do, but they don't really enforce it. I've probably been in 50 meetings where a business unit manager or some senior leader in a business unit is talking to their manager and saying, look, we have this production schedule or the ability to handle so many of these cases or whatever it is, and we have this many people to do it. Here's the load that the PMO is putting on us. What do you want us to do? And the executive almost all the time gives lip service to the PMO and concentrates on the operational aspects of the business and does not support the PMO. And it was usually that very same executive that might have had a meeting pardon me, the day before with the PMO, insisting that that PMO go out and get those business units to do some set of tasks. So this is training the business units to push back, and the executive, when faced with an operational decision will usually side with operational results, not administrative results. Not always, but certainly they cave enough times to make the PMO basically weak. So the business model is no good for this situation, right? The PMO tries to force it. The business executive sometimes says, your pay depends on your ability to get these business units to do things. You go to the business unit, their pay is not aligned with the things that the PMO is trying to do. So you're basically asking a business unit to compromise perhaps their personal bonus, or if it's government or nonprofit or something, at least their performance to do something for the PMO without really telling them why, without enforcing it. This is a throw everything against the wall and see what sticks by executives. The executives don't gain, the business units don't gain, and the PMO is at grave risk of disbanding. Right? The PMO in this case is likely to be a temporary PMO. And don't get me wrong, I like it when our customers call me with this problem because it's a good consulting engagement. It's just horrible for the customer to get in that situation at the same time. It's bad business. You put people's goals directly in conflict and expect them to work it out somehow without a clear-cut set of priorities and a decision from the business executive. That's pretty much crazy talk. Let's look at the other side of that coin. Reporting, right? So let's define reporting. That's usually summarization of data. In most cases, where does that data come from? Somebody has to enter it, and somebody has to check it, and somebody has to set up a process, and somebody has to set up a tool, right? And let's drop down to the third bullet point there. When they do, this will show, there's no other way to say it, but glaring gaps of execution by business units or the functional unit in the organization. Glaring gaps on projects, right? Because remember, to the PMO, projects are everything. To the business unit, projects are usually a very small subset of their work. They're extra. They're not operations. Projects don't make money for business units. They cost money. Projects don't give people back time. They cost time, including the management distraction of constant monitoring and occasional intervention. Right? So projects are the future, and the projects that are performed may very well be the profit or the great performance in the public sector, nonprofit sector, but they don't make any money right now. They don't get anything done right now. Operations gets those things done. So do you want to get something done, or do you want to do something that may or may not pay off in the future? And in fact, the whole project may fail, wasting all the work. That's what I hear as a pushback. So what's the result? PMO loses more power. Business units circumvent the PMO communication, have one-on-ones with their executive. The executive does the same thing, right? They don't support the PMO. Even though the PMO is carrying out their instructions, they usually cave in. There's not a better word for it. And I know things are complicated, right? But if they're complicated, don't make the directive. If you're going to back off on it, don't make the directive, right? Executives, this is a very well-known, all the way back to Drucker on management, only make a directive that you're willing to put your personal attention and energy into guaranteeing that it's fulfilled every time. So there can be a limited number of directives. PMOs, many times, when I look at their directive, there's dozens of directives that PMOs have to do. And people are always put in the position of having to choose between all these directives. plus their operations, PMOs are at desperate risk. So what's part of the message here, right? We have to be the change as executives, as business unit managers, as PMO leaders that we want to see in the organization. PMOs, perhaps more than any type of organization, same thing with business analysts, center of excellence types, right? Any organization that purports to try to build up a more effective, more efficient, less risk, more transparent set of processes is in the same boat. We basically need to choose far fewer change items and wrap them with robust change management if we want them to work. Right? So what can we do? For one thing, the PMO has to be relieved of the obligation to tell business units that basically outrank them what to do. PMOs should not implement executive directives. Executives should not give directives to PMOs for them to make business units execute. It just doesn't work. It's bad business. Right? That doesn't mean PMOs don't have a place. Most PMOs are the center of excellence for the project management experience within an organization. Not all of them, right? They could own the tools, the processes, the templates. They could own the people that manage those large cross-functional projects. They could mentor project managers that report to business units or work within a single business unit. There's lots of things they can do. Notice nowhere in there did I say try to make business units do stuff. Doesn't work. It's never worked. We've looked at dozens and dozens of PMOs, sometimes 2 or 3 times, and it just doesn't work. Right? So here's the salt lick. For those of you in Texas, it's about engagement. And again, we do this in a live setting. Let's just talk it through here, and you pop in any questions or comments you want to make, and we'll pick them up in a bit. How do you foster engagement around a process change, doing some sort of administrative overhead, process improvement, coming to meetings? Let's just think for a minute quietly, how do you do that? And we'll give you a couple of ideas in just 1 minute. Okay, so what might we do? Right? Please just pop that out as a comment if you have something to say. Right? We'll give you a little bit of information here. It's still funny. Meetings that occasionally, not all the time, then it becomes an entitlement, provide food, have better attendance. That's just how it works. Distributed meeting, a little bit tougher. Still can be done if you have several groups meeting in several central locations. If everybody's on the phone working from home, obviously that's not going to work much. Also, having meals together. There's something about breaking bread and discussing goals and getting together that makes things just go a little smoother, right? Even in these days of restricted travel budget, if you are not co-located with some of your major project stakeholders, go see them once in a while, or when when somebody's traveling, make sure to get on their schedule. Another piece of information here is negotiating the processes. Where I see a lot of PMOs go wrong is they don't really negotiate the processes that everybody needs to do on a project up front. They just sort of tell people, sometimes well after the work has been assigned and negotiated. So we have a nice way to do that. It's called a work informal contract. And in it, it basically says, when you accept doing this work for this project, you also accept putting in the needed status in the way the project needs to do it every time on time. That is part of the work. You also accept that you will let people know if you think there's any indication at all that there might be a deadline that's missed. You also let people know that if you have any indication you're going to be pulled off or have a personal situation or anything that would keep you from achieving the work on a project at the level of quality that's necessary, you're to get with the project manager right away by the agreed communication mechanism. You don't wait till you're late, right? So this is a formal contract that we have people actually sign as we go through this process, so that they can pay attention to all the work, and then we reinforce it starting with the kickoff meeting. Every project meeting we reinforce the process. We ask people to do only the amount of process that's absolutely necessary. We never ask them to do anything optional, because guess what? There's no time anymore to do any optional processes. If it's necessary, it should be mandatory, and it should have the full force and weight of the organization behind it, including the executive sponsors who need to support it and make sure everybody's on the same page. If that doesn't happen, almost everything will be looked at as optional when push comes to shove, which it always will, and a lot of those processes will not be executed. Executives will not support it. The whole process pretty much falls apart from a PMO perspective, right? Pretty much falls apart. So the impact of the work that's asked is something absolutely crucial to show people. What is the downstream effect? What are they doing? How does their work flow through to make the entire product of the project better, right? And we constantly solicit feedback on all the processes, because guess what? All of us are more clever than any of us. People that are pressed for time sometimes get almost genius level ideas on how to reduce overhead and process burden, how to automate something, how to do it faster, better. And it's their job to question the processes to make sure that we're only executing what we absolutely have to. So that means for every process, you have to have a justification, not because Jim Bob or Sally Bob said to do it. That's not a justification. That's a directive once removed that doesn't work. What's the impact on the project or the organization of not doing that process? It better be big. The impact better be big, right? Okay, so here's a best practice for you to think about. an executive should require their business unit to construct specific deliverables. If it's necessary, it should be mandatory. If the executive wants a business unit to do something, they should tell that business unit, not tell the PMO. The PMO can know, obviously, because they may help, but do not make the PMO deliver the message for anything mandatory. It's a poor business model. The executive pushes the expertise, etc., of the PMO leaders, right? The PMO is there to help organizations start, execute, and successfully finish their projects, period. We are service organizations. We are not the tail wagging the dog, right? If projects don't get done sooner, cheaper, and better with less risk, then we should not have a PMO in that organization. That's the purpose of a PMO, to help projects be completed at the reasonable level of quality, cheaper and faster. Cheaper and faster. If it's not cheaper and faster with the PMO is at grave risk. And the executive could suggest PMO resources because, look, they know how to do this. They've done it with other projects. Here's some testimonials from some of the other business units on how much smoother and faster and better a project was when the PMO was consulted. Here's some business units that have had failed projects that were of a size that they probably would have been better had they involved the PMO. So let's think about this for a second. Let's recap this agile and integrated best practice. The executive wants something done. The executive tells the business units, keeping the PMO informed. The executive pushes the PMO as experts, extra pair of hands. They may or may not be billable to the business unit. The executive supports the PMO as being, look, if you want to get something done, you need to involve the PMO. They will help you get it done better, faster, cheaper. That's the reason. Okay, here's some examples, right, of topics that PMOs know and some ways to think about pursuing these topics, right? So we know that there are processes that if they're followed, a project will be better at less risk, probably be cheaper and faster, right? We know that. To business units, that left-hand column of process looks extra. They don't view it many times as real work, right? They don't view it as real work. We have to get it set that that is real work. You need one work cube, right? Here's an example. Some of these are from our courses, either project management or business analysis, of here's some types of things that a PMO or a business analyst center of excellence can bring to the table, right? We know that there are inputs that if they exist, they make the process of eliciting requirements and documenting those requirements much easier and much better and usually faster and cheaper. So we know to go across and make sure that everybody's roles and responsibilities on the stakeholder list are complete, that there's an adequate business case so we can generate attention to the project as we move forward. That there's a requirements or a scope management plan, that we have negotiated the processes with our stakeholders that need to be executed for successful elicitation. Right? We know on the other side, that regardless of what you name these, that there are some requirements that need to be documented. There are also resources that need to be scheduled to perform the requirements elicitation, the SMEs, the subject matter experts. We know there are formal and informal issues. All of those need to be recorded, right, and other supporting type areas. So if you take one more drop down, just in preparing, you want to have those things on the left ready to go. And when you come out of preparing, you want to make sure that all your resources are scheduled. That doesn't mean just send somebody an email and ask them to come to a meeting, right? That's where a lot of frustration is. With our clients all around the world right now, the biggest frustration is that people don't have time to do the work on the project. They don't have time to come to meetings. They don't want to spend the time providing adequate requirements, and yet they have a high standard of excellence and success for finished products. And nobody has time. That's why we need to focus on a few projects at once and make sure they're adequately resourced and we aren't distracting everyone across too large a base. There are learnable and teachable, demonstratable elements and techniques to go through for every type of activity in project management business analysis, right? There's various things you do to clarify. There are specific domain of activities just in prepare for elicitation, and there's dozens of these, right? You need to make some choice, some blend of interviews and workshops, observation, prototyping, research, things like that. You know, people in PMOs know these things. We can train, we can help people. This is where the value lies, in the deep expertise of people, not just in the subject matter of the business or the public or nonprofit organization, but in the process, right? It seems thick, but if you have a project of sufficient complexity, especially one that is distributed in nature, people are around the globe, or one that involves vendors, or any type of external robust process like IT, then getting to the root of things is very powerful. Right? So let's look at this best practice. When we talk to business unit executives, they don't use the word resent most of the time, but it's perfectly clear to a trained interviewer like myself that they don't like it. You have somebody telling them what to do that's not their boss, that may or may not have their best interests at heart, and is trying to get them to do things that is reducing their output from their operations. The only reasonable alternative here is collaboration, right? And the best way to get that collaboration is to have the business unit people participating in a series of live and dormant teams that own and manage and arbitrate all the processes in a PMO. Otherwise, you'll end up with, regardless of your intent, telling people what to do and how to do it. That puts people in a place of impossible relationship management. Right? So here's some of the benefits. You may not need specific PMO staff. Maybe just one person or two people. Don't hire anybody that doesn't manage projects. and that includes the director. Yes, I have been a PMO director, VP, several times. Yes, we have helped multiple organizations form and manage and reform their PMOs. Do not build a stable, right? So what do you do then when there's a large project that spans organizations? You reach into an organization and pull somebody out to manage that project. In some organizations, especially those that don't have hundreds of thousands of people in them, you can actually outsource your PMO executive leadership. We perform that role. We know several other firms that perform that role. They're objective. They can come in sometimes on a part-time basis, ongoing, sometimes years at a time, manage a PMO using best practices without all the overhead of having a PMO executive in there worrying about their career path and worrying about their ongoing relationships with business units. They can be relatively apolitical. You can also rotate people through a PMO assignment for a month or two, full-time or part-time, where they serve as the team lead for constant massaging for ongoing continuous improvement, and also for those times when processes really have to be revamped due to technology or a best practice or somehow they just got stale. Right? With virtual teams always standing that don't have to put too much time in it, but everybody who leads projects participates on at least one team. That is a sustainable model. So what would you do? Right? The first step is review executive goals. And one way to prepare for that is to go back through the leader of your PMO, look at all their notes when they meet with executives, and try to pull out into one list all the things they told the PMO or they told the PMO to have business units do. And before you go back and talk to the executives, go through and try to think about what is the underlying goal of this directive and try to group them under underlying goal and prioritize them by goal, and within goal each type of thing is going to be done, or skip the goals and just prioritize the directives so you have one list. Right? Take a look at the PMO and what it's trying to do. If there's anybody not managing projects, assign them a project today. You may still be able to save it. Everybody, including an admin in a PMO who's maybe managing SharePoint or Project Server or one of the other dozens and dozens of tools, should be managing projects. They need to know what it's like. They need to constantly be looking at how they can ease the documentation, the paperwork, the overhead, dual reporting burden. Then have a chat with your executive or team of executives as a PMO and say, look, we think this could go a lot better. We've talked to business units. They're not really happy. We're not really happy. You're not really happy. Let's change it. Right? Take a look at my blog for a couple of ideas, but let's go virtual. Let's get people working on projects more. Let's unburden them with all this overhead and see exactly what's necessary for what type of projects. Agree on that up front and move forward. If not these exact steps, you should be taking some steps, right? And this is the good fight. This is the fight against bureaucracy. This is the fight against an executive throwing things against the wall to see what sticks. This is a fight against the relationships that are so difficult to maintain when two experienced leaders are put head to head with different goals and different processes. Right? Of course, we do a lot of consulting, training. These will be available if someone wants to go through it. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So Krista, if you would jump in here with some of the questions if people have them.
Yeah, sure. So we still have time for a few more questions, but looks like we have a couple coming through already. The first one comes from John, and he wants to know, how do we know if our PMO is in need of reorganizing around these best practices?
Okay, so that's a great question. I mean, how do you know, right? My thought is ask your business units that you serve, not your executives. Ask your business units, right? And they will tell you if it's frustrating. Ask them if they're frustrated. Ask them how you can improve. Ask them what their goals are for the PMO. Ask them if they feel that your PMO contributes to their bottom line or is somewhat of a distraction. I mean, those are hard words, right? But those are the words that we hear as outsiders when we talk to business units before advising a PMO on how to improve their operation. So sometimes it might be better to go outside to have somebody do that. You probably can do it. Depends on the relationship, right? If they're frustrated, right, ask them questions like, would you do these processes, and give them some specific processes that you've been forcing on them for quite some time. Would you do those if we weren't forcing you to do them? I think you'll be surprised at the answers you get if you have a good relationship and people are transparent and honest with you. We've never gotten business units that say they're satisfied with the PMO. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, and we're probably not called in when everything's perfect. I'm just saying that I've never heard it from a single person. So start there, and then if you're brave, ask your executive. I go, hey, here's the communications and summary that we've had about you telling us to get the business units to do stuff over the last 6 months. We have a spotty record of making that happen. We need to change this to get more of this done for you. And here's how, right? So great question. Who else has one? Kristen?
Okay. This next one comes from Andy, and he wants to know, how can we bring a customized version of this talk to our management team?
Well, just give me a call or shoot me an email, right? And the thing there to think about, unless you have an incredibly collaborative management team, that there'll probably be a little pre-work to do, several days, or if it's a large organization, maybe even weeks, to structure this the right way so that it's in a politically consumable message. Because just giving people data, even if it might be correct, is not the key to happiness here. It's making sure the message is consumable and it's geared and staged directly with your executive's goals for this year. Right? That's a great question. Probably have time for one or two more.
Okay, this one comes from Sarah, and she wants to know, what is a good first step we can take to align our PMO in a global organization?
Right. So right now we're helping 2 global organizations align their PMOs. They're plural there. And we've helped several organizations try a couple of different things. What seems to work best is really figuring out what their current goals are for this year. Unless your fiscal year is ending in March, then do next year, right, or April. This year, what are their goals? And then go back from a PMO perspective and look and see how many of the things you're trying to do align directly with their goals. And what you might find, as with most of our clients, that most of the things that you're trying to do probably do not align directly with their goals. Hence the friction. What else could you expect? Right? So then it's to sit down and have that conversation with that executive who owns the PMO. I don't mean the PMO director. I mean the C-level or very senior leader in your organization, and say, what are you trying to do with this? There's a better way. Right? That's the way. So I know we're at time here. I want to honor that, but I'd be happy to stick around and answer questions if people have to go. And if there's another question or two, I'd be happy to do that, but don't feel like you have to stick for it. Krista, what have you got?
Do you have some more time for one more question, or?
I do, certainly.
Okay, this next question comes from Tim, and he wants to know, how can we form a PMO that will be stable and add value for a long time?
Right, so I think while there are other models that can work, the virtual model is best, where there are project managers either working in or assigned to business or functional units, and they also participate in the PMO with a trained facilitator, maybe a PMO director or somebody like myself who can pull them together and constantly make sure all the processes are owned, but also make sure that the project managers are working hand in glove with the business units to make sure that they get their goals done. And they can channel that executive communication between the high-level executives and the business units and not try to get in the middle of that, but be the solution, not the problem. So, all right.
Okay, wonderful. Well, looks like we're kind of pushing it with our time, but I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of their busy schedules to spend with us today. If you have any more questions about what Daryl's talking about, we'll leave some info on the screen for you. But that's about all. And have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks, Christy. You did a great job.